For more than half a century, France stood as the self-appointed guardian of its former African colonies. It built military bases, managed currencies, financed governments, and influenced the destiny of nations from Dakar to Niamey. The arrangement even had a name whispered in diplomatic halls and printed in history books: Françafrique. To many in the West, it symbolized partnership and progress. To many Africans, it represented control disguised as friendship. Yet the balance of power is shifting. A new generation of African leaders is rising, one that has studied the cost of dependence and learned from decades of exploitation. They now speak the language of sovereignty, not submission. Across the Sahel, flags that once stood beside the French tricolor are being lowered. Embassies that once dictated policies now face silence and skepticism. From Mali to Niger to Burkina Faso, the message is clear: the age of obedience has ended. In Burkina Faso, a young soldier named Ibrahim Traoré has become the face of this transformation. His rise was not simply a change in leadership, but a declaration of independence in a new form. When he told his people that Africa's real battle was not against terrorism, but against a system built to keep it weak, his words struck a deep chord. His decision to remove French troops from Burkinabe soil was more than symbolic. It was the start of a continental awakening that began to echo far beyond his country's borders. In Paris, policymakers watched with unease. For decades, their influence had seemed unshakable. Now it was slipping, not because of force, but because of belief. The people of the Sahel no longer looked to Paris for protection. They were looking to each other. Across dusty roads and crowded markets, a new kind of pride began to grow, quiet but steady. For the first time in generations, Africans were writing their own narrative of freedom, one that no longer needed validation from foreign powers. The question that remains is not whether France is losing control of Africa, but what will rise in its place. Is this the beginning of a new independence, or the start of a deeper struggle for the continent's soul? For decades, the system known as Françafrique operated in the shadows of diplomacy. It was not a single agreement or treaty, but a network of influence woven into every corner of African governance. French advisors whispered in presidential offices. French companies controlled gold, oil, and uranium. The CFA franc, a currency tied directly to Paris, dictated the financial heartbeat of 14 nations. And when a leader dared to challenge that control, history often ended his story before it could begin. From Togo's Sylvanus Olympio in the 1960s to Burkina Faso's Thomas Sankara in the 1980s, the pattern was painfully familiar. For a long time, it seemed that France's grip on Africa could not be broken. The system survived coups, revolutions, and changes of government. It survived because it did not depend on one man or one administration. It depended on fear. The fear that without France, chaos would return. The fear that without the CFA franc, economies would collapse. The fear that without French troops, terrorists would overrun the Sahel. For years, that fear was enough. But fear is a fragile foundation, and when belief begins to shift, even the most powerful empires start to crack. The change began quietly. In Mali, a group of officers overthrew a government accused of corruption and dependency. Their words sounded familiar, but their tone was different. They no longer asked France for reform. They demanded freedom. Soon after, Niger followed, then Burkina Faso. Three nations once seen as the cornerstones of French strategy in Africa suddenly stood outside its control. The tricolor flags over military compounds were lowered. French convoys rolled toward the borders under the eyes of cheering crowds. In the markets of Bamako and Ouagadougou, people spoke with a pride that had not been heard for generations. Inside France, the reaction was a mix of disbelief and denial. Some politicians called it a temporary setback. Others blamed Russian propaganda. Few wanted to admit that the roots of the rebellion ran far deeper than any foreign influence. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. France had treated sovereignty as something to be managed, not respected. It spoke of partnership while keeping its hand on the steering wheel. And now, that wheel was being pulled away. For the people of the Sahel, the departure of French troops was more than a political event. It was a psychological turning point. In villages where foreign soldiers once patrolled, locals began organizing their own defense units. Farmers and traders donated supplies to community militias. Teachers used classroom time to discuss the meaning of independence. Across radio stations, songs celebrating national pride replaced Western pop music. It was as if a region long held in the shadow of foreign control had finally found its voice. Still, the transition was not easy. As French forces withdrew, new threats emerged. Terror groups tested the borders, hoping to exploit the power vacuum. Western media described the situation as instability. But on the ground, many Africans described it as growing pains, the necessary struggle of nations reclaiming their own direction. A young woman in Niamey summed it up simply. "Freedom is never comfortable," she said, "but it is worth the discomfort." In Paris, officials tried to rebuild relationships, offering economic cooperation instead of military aid. But the trust was gone. Decades of dependency had left scars too deep to heal quickly. New partners entered the scene, including Russia, China, and regional alliances that promised mutual respect rather than oversight. Whether those promises would hold was uncertain, but they carried one powerful idea that France had failed to offer: dignity. By late 2024, the phrase "the end of Françafrique" appeared not just in headlines, but in academic journals and political debates. What had once been a quiet system of control was now a symbol of resistance. The streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey echoed with slogans calling for unity and African ownership of African futures. The fall of Françafrique was not a single moment, but a slow unraveling of an illusion. And yet, as the dust settled, one question remained. Could Africa truly build a new future without repeating the mistakes of the past? Could independence finally mean more than survival? The end of Françafrique did not leave a vacuum of silence. It created an open field where new powers rushed to plant their flags. As French soldiers packed their equipment and left dusty airstrips behind, aircraft from other nations began to arrive. The uniforms were different, the accents unfamiliar, but the purpose was familiar to anyone who understood history. In a world where power never truly disappears, it simply changes hands. In Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, delegations from Moscow and Beijing began to appear more frequently. Russia offered security contracts and weapons at lower cost. China proposed railroads, solar energy grids, and loans for digital infrastructure. Both promised partnership instead of control, respect instead of lectures. For many Africans, these words sounded like a fresh wind after years of being spoken to rather than spoken with. But even new winds can carry old storms. In the capital of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré understood this better than most. He accepted new partnerships cautiously, aware that dependency wears many masks. "We are open to cooperation," he told his ministers, "but not to new masters." Under his leadership, Burkina Faso began negotiating deals that placed ownership firmly in national hands. Mining contracts required local participation. Security agreements demanded transparency. Infrastructure projects were built with African engineers alongside foreign teams. For a time, it felt like the balance of power was beginning to shift in Africa's favor. Yet the struggle for influence was not limited to foreign capitals. Within Africa itself, rival visions began to emerge. Some leaders sought to align closely with Moscow, hoping for military strength to secure their rule. Others leaned toward China, drawn by promises of trade and technology. Still others advocated for a third path, one of regional unity and African cooperation. The Sahel Alliance, born from shared defiance, tried to turn that unity into action. Joint patrols secured borderlands, and shared radio frequencies coordinated intelligence. It was imperfect and fragile, but it represented something Africa had long lacked: self-defense guided by self-interest. In the West, analysts watched with mixed emotions. Some feared that Africa was simply trading one empire for another. Others saw it as an inevitable correction to centuries of imbalance. For the United States, the situation posed a new question. Could Washington engage with Africa as an equal partner, or would it continue the pattern of distant management? American diplomats began quietly seeking meetings in Dakar and Accra, hoping to find common ground before the continent's alliances solidified elsewhere. Meanwhile, African citizens followed the shifts with cautious optimism. In markets and schools, the conversation was no longer about who would rule Africa, but how Africa would rule itself. Teachers began rewriting history lessons to include African perspectives. University students debated whether independence could survive globalization. Even musicians and filmmakers joined the movement, creating art that celebrated identity rather than imitation. But change never arrives without resistance. Disinformation campaigns flooded social media, spreading confusion and mistrust. Some were traced to Western sources, others to new players testing their reach. The digital battlefield became as important as the physical one. Nations began to build cyber defense units, often staffed by young programmers trained locally. The war for Africa's future was now being fought with both code and conviction. As months passed, the struggle for influence evolved from external competition to internal reflection. The question was no longer simply about France or Russia or China. It was about what kind of Africa would emerge from the contest. A continent united by pride and purpose, or one divided by ambition and fear. In a speech before the National Assembly, Traoré put it plainly: "We cannot ask the world to respect us if we do not respect ourselves. The day Africa learns to trust its own strength, the world will no longer treat us as clients, but as equals." His words were met with applause that rolled through the chamber like thunder. For the first time in decades, the narrative of Africa was being written not in Paris, London, or Washington, but in the cities and villages of the continent itself. Still, even as hope grew, the stakes remained high. The collapse of one system had not guaranteed freedom. It had merely opened the door to a new kind of struggle, one fought not just between nations, but within hearts and minds. Could Africa learn to walk its own path, without stumbling into the traps of history once again? As the echoes of old empires faded, a new rhythm began to emerge across Africa. It was quieter than the sound of revolution, but stronger than the noise of politics. It was the rhythm of sovereignty, the steady heartbeat of nations learning to stand upright again after generations spent on their knees. In the streets of Ouagadougou, in the markets of Niamey, and in the classrooms of Bamako, a new language began to take shape. It was not French or English or Arabic. It was the language of ownership, of pride, of destiny reclaimed. In Burkina Faso, the change was visible in the smallest details. School children recited poems about courage instead of colonial explorers. Radio programs discussed African inventions, not imported trends. Farmers pooled their savings to create local cooperatives free from foreign banks. What had started as a political rebellion was turning into a cultural awakening. People no longer waited for outside approval. They had begun to see sovereignty not as a slogan, but as a way of life. President Ibrahim Traoré often reminded his ministers that independence meant more than changing flags. Freedom, he said, is a discipline. His government began prioritizing education and agricultural reform over military expansion. Universities launched new programs in engineering and resource management. Young Burkinabe were encouraged to study in African institutions rather than abroad, building a generation that could sustain progress without foreign tutelage. The goal was not isolation, but balance, a future where Africa could collaborate without being consumed. Elsewhere across the continent, similar movements took root. In Senegal, youth groups demanded economic transparency from their leaders. In Ghana, local industries began producing goods once imported from Europe. In Mali and Niger, regional alliances sought to strengthen security without reliance on Western forces. Together, these acts formed the quiet architecture of a new Africa. It was not a single revolution, but 1,000 small awakenings converging into one. Yet this rise of sovereignty was not without challenges. Corruption still lingered, and poverty remained a daily reality for millions. Foreign corporations continued to pressure governments with offers disguised as opportunities. The temptation to return to old dependencies never fully disappeared. But there was a growing awareness that the continent's future could no longer be outsourced. A student in Ouagadougou described it best. "We may still struggle," she said, "but at least now, it is our struggle." The international community watched this transformation with mixed emotions. Some Western analysts warned of instability and isolationism. Others recognized the shift as a natural correction in global power. African thinkers, meanwhile, called it the second independence, not fought with guns, but with minds and hands. The continent was beginning to believe that sovereignty could be built through patience, creativity, and faith, rather than violence or dependence. Religious leaders and elders also played a quiet role in guiding this renewal. In mosques, churches, and village squares, they spoke of integrity, stewardship, and unity. They reminded people that true freedom required moral strength as much as political will. These voices grounded the movement, connecting the practical with the spiritual. For many, sovereignty was not just about control of resources, but about restoring dignity to everyday life. The most profound change was psychological. For decades, Africa had been taught to see itself through the eyes of others. Now, it was beginning to look inward with clarity and confidence. African writers, filmmakers, and musicians found new inspiration in their heritage. They told stories of survival and resilience, not tragedy. They sang of futures, not fears. Across the continent, culture was becoming the most powerful form of resistance. In Burkina Faso, a mural appeared on the side of a school building. It showed a young child planting a tree beneath a rising sun. Below it were painted the words, "We build what we believe." That simple image captured the essence of the moment. Africa was no longer waiting for liberation from outside forces. It was cultivating freedom from within. Still, even as the seeds of sovereignty took root, uncertainty remained. The continent stood at a crossroads, torn between opportunity and old habits. The question that echoed through every parliament, every classroom, and every prayer was the same. Could Africa hold on to its newfound confidence without repeating the mistakes of the past? The answer, perhaps, would depend on whether its leaders and its people could remember that sovereignty is not a destination, but a discipline renewed each morning. The rise of African sovereignty did not go unnoticed. In Washington, Paris, and Brussels, policymakers gathered behind closed doors, studying the sudden shift with a mix of curiosity and alarm. Reports described the Sahel as strategically unrecognizable. The networks that had once secured Western access to African minerals, trade routes, and military footholds were vanishing. What replaced them was something far less predictable: nations that were finally acting in their own interest. In France, the reaction was personal. For decades, its identity as a global power had depended on its African presence. The withdrawal from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso was seen by many as the end of an era. News anchors spoke of betrayal. Former officials warned that France was losing its influence to Moscow and Beijing. But outside the political echo chamber, many ordinary citizens simply asked a harder question. Had France ever truly treated Africa as an equal? The silence that followed was its own answer. In the United States, analysts took a more cautious view. Some saw opportunity where others saw loss. A new generation of diplomats argued that engaging Africa with respect could rebuild trust and counter rising rivals. Washington began quietly shifting tone, emphasizing partnership instead of patronage. Yet old habits die hard. Economic interests still outweighed empathy, and lectures about democracy often sounded hollow coming from those who had ignored African voices for decades. Meanwhile, in Beijing and Moscow, celebration came easily. Both powers framed Africa's awakening as proof of Western decline. Russian state media praised Traoré and other Sahelian leaders as symbols of defiance. China's foreign ministry released statements calling the rise of African self-determination a new chapter of global balance. But even their enthusiasm carried calculation. Each new alliance offered potential leverage in the world's next great contest for resources and influence. For Africa, these global ripples were both validation and warning. The world had begun to see it not as a passive stage, but as a player shaping its own script. Yet every partnership carried risk, and every promise demanded scrutiny. The eyes of the world were once again on Africa, but this time, Africa was staring back. The question that now hovers over every capital from Paris to Washington to Ouagadougou is simple. Will the world learn to respect a rising Africa, or merely try to control it by new means? As the sun sets over the red plains of the Sahel, Africa stands at the threshold of a new dawn. The old maps have begun to fade, and with them, the illusions that once defined an entire continent. In their place rises a generation no longer content to be a chapter in someone else's story. From the markets of Ouagadougou to the coast of Dakar, the word sovereignty has taken on a new meaning. It is no longer just a political goal. It has become a daily act of faith. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré often speaks of freedom as a discipline rather than a destination. His nation, still scarred by decades of foreign interference, is learning to walk on its own again. The checkpoints that once symbolized control now stand as reminders of vigilance. The people who once looked outward for solutions are now looking inward, drawing strength from tradition, unity, and belief. Freedom has never been easy, but for the first time in decades, it feels within reach. Across Africa, the winds of renewal are shifting the balance of history. Countries that once feared isolation now find confidence in cooperation. Regional alliances, cultural revival, and economic independence are reshaping what it means to be African in the 21st century. The journey is uncertain, and the cost is heavy, but the spirit that drives it is unbreakable. For those who doubted that Africa could stand without permission, the proof now lies in its endurance. The world is watching. Some observe with hope, others with hesitation. But what happens next will not be decided in Paris or Washington. It will be written in the classrooms, farms, and hearts of ordinary Africans who have chosen dignity over dependence. This is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of one still being written, line by line, by a people who have refused to kneel. If this story has touched you, do not let it fade. Reflect, speak, and share what you feel. Because freedom is not sustained by power alone, but by the courage to protect what is right. May God bless those who still believe that Africa's light, once awakened, will never again be dimmed.